Xenoblade Chronicles is a video game.
Sure.
Not just that, it's a series filled with great stories, but did you know the Xenoblade structure?
Huh?
Yeah, the Xenoblade structure. Did you not know of the Xenoblade structure? What are you, a no-pun too busy with tasty sausages and red pollen orbs to know about the Xenoblade structure? Well, I can't blame you, considering the fact that I made up the term about 5 minutes ago. So getting into it, I tend to find that Xenoblade stories are broken up into two major chunks. The first chunk normally concerns some very human theme. Xenoblade 1's first chunk is all about revenge and the cycle of hatred. Xenoblade 2 is all about how humans treat each other, especially in a dying world. Xenoblade 3 talks about the cycle of war and what it's like to only know war, and have your inherently human characterizations stripped away from you, and what it's like to slowly learn about them. And at some point in the story, not necessarily or even often, does the second chunk of the story come at the halfway point. It normally comes relatively close to the end of the game or in the final quarter. And with the second chunk, the theme of the game, that was always just kind of there, a little bit, now takes center stage and is revealed to be the main theme of the game and lesson of the story that the characters will need to learn to emerge victorious. Xenoblade 1's second chunk is all about creating a world where people have the choice to choose their own path, a world without gods, which can be taken as a world without fate or anyone controlling or dictating your lives. The ability to choose your own path, to walk the future, at least walk to the future, instead of being forced to walk someone else's path. Xenoblade 2 and its second chunk concerns the fact that there is no finish line, no paradise to reach to have all of your problems and humanity's problems solved for you. It's a daily struggle where you have to work hard, learn from the past, and grind not just for yourself, but with all of humanity together to create a future of your own design. To create a world where you can say it's better off than when you found it, and to pass on those ideals to future generations. It's not easy, but we can't reach Elysium. We have to create it together. Xenoblade 3's second chunk is realizing that this momentary happiness or routine is just that, a product of the present. But despite that comfortability or happiness that we feel right now, we must be willing to keep walking on into the future to create our own path, even if that means sadness and partings with the ones we love. We do it not because we are guaranteed a happy ending, but because we must walk into a future where we are able to walk our own path, because that is freedom. Cue the Eren Yeager freedom gif. This duality in a Xenoblade experience is part of its charm for me. You kind of get two stories for the price of one when you really think about it, at least in terms of thematic expression, or experiences, because if one chunk of a Xenoblade story is underdeveloped, it could potentially compromise the overall experience, depending upon your own perspective. As a bit of a disclaimer, all three of these games are in my top 10 games of all time, but if I was to say my biggest critique with any of the Xenoblade games, it's important to understand this chunk concept from which Xenoblade games are made, or at least in my opinion experienced, because my biggest critique with one of these games comes from this chunk design. So let's focus in on Xenoblade 3, because if you ask me my favorite Xenoblade stories, I would rank them 2, 1, and then 3. And the reason 3 is behind 2 and 1 for me comes from my biggest critique, at least when it comes to 3's story. It isn't the characters, and it isn't the world, or even the message. It's the development of that second chunk of the game that is meant to focus in on that theme. And nuance is key here, because I think the execution of the theme and conveying it is really compelling. However, the events surrounding it suffer a pacing issue for me, and let's get into that. Pacing is always an interesting thing to critique, and to discuss overall, because it affects people differently. To one person, a scene or a story could be too fast or too slow to properly convey what they're trying to convey, but for someone else, it could be perfect. And any combination you can think of, it lies on a spectrum in that regard. For me, and what I personally like out of stories, I would argue the second chunk of Xenoblade 3 is too fast in terms of its pacing. So, let's identify where the second chunk even begins. And I would argue it begins relatively late in the game, with a decent way into Chapter 6, right after the Agnes Castle section. That's when I would say the second chunk begins. When you set off towards the Etia region once again to find Queen Nia. And to me, the pacing that helped make the story of chapters 1 to 5 so special becomes compromised, as the story events that do happen are still really compelling and engrossing, but this simply isn't enough for them for me. After the Agnes Castle section, what do you really do? I was ready to take the fight to Mobius and begin this giant struggle, but what do we really end up doing main story-wise for the rest of the game? We free Miyabi and Kemuravi, which is a cool scene, to be fair, We beat D&J and free Queen Nia. Again, great scenes. Then we get the 15-minute exposition cutscene that every Xenoblade game needs. And then we're sent along on a fetch quest to build a boat, a faster boat than the one we already had. Then it's immediately into the final dungeon of Origin. You breathe through it, and then it's final boss time. Outside of that one, again, really good section with N. If I had to make a comparison to how this feels to me, it would be like if after the Egil fight in Xenoblade 1, that we immediately would just go to Prison Island after doing, say, a fetch quest to get there, and begin the end of the game. Whereas, in Xenoblade 1, there was a lot more build-up and character moments between those 2 points in time that made the experience all the sweeter and heartbreaking, and more emotionally resonant for me that I simply didn't get with Xenoblade 3. Because again, the moments that are there are still really good, I just want some more connective tissue, if that makes sense. It's kind of funny, you know. The more I think about this, the more I think I'm beginning to understand why I didn't initially like Xenoblade 3's ending. I eventually came around to it, don't get me wrong, because again, the story events themselves are still really compelling, but there was something missing that just didn't make it land for me initially. Besides the fact that I was so high on copium that they would reunite in the post-credit scene, because let's be honest, it's a Xenoblade game, so none of the emotion of them parting had a massive effect on me, outside of that one scene where the world itself was separating as they were running towards each other. That one was just mean, Monolith, FYI. It was mean, rude, and unkind to my emotional well-being. Outside of that, though, I was still sure they would reunite within like 5 minutes after the credits. Obviously, that didn't happen. I can only talk about my own experiences. Many out there, probably many of you watching this video, had a different, more positive reception to this final leg of Xenoblade 3, and that's fine. It's completely cool to feel that way. I'm not saying that my opinion on this subject is the objective reality or the truth. It is to me, but it may not be for you, because again, it's subjective. And I wish I shared that sentiment. I prefer to enjoy things, but can't help it when I don't enjoy them at least as much as I would like. I was being a little bit cheeky earlier, but there is no real objective correct answer here. But for me, I would have liked to have seen something done to really make me hate Z as a character specifically. Because I never really did. N was the one who was in our faces the entire time, or at least throughout chapter 5 and 6, and then even near the end in Origin. He was the one responsible for the entire Eclipse part of the game, which I viewed to be Xenoblade 3's strongest scene. Zed, and I'll constantly change how I say his name because I personally find it funny, was the motivating factor behind everything, including Z. But he was always in the background, silently, largely just watching on. So maybe what I would have liked to have seen is something involving Zed more directly confronting us as Ouroboros, possibly trying to find and crack, or any kind of crack in our proverbial armor that we had formed in chapter 5 and 6, and make Noah and crew second-guess the decision at the beginning of chapter 6, because they kind of do this at the very end with Noah, right before Origin activates, where he has this one brief moment where you know he's considering walking the path that ended. Maybe playing into that a little bit more, but again, you run the risk of overplaying that card. It kind of boils down to how I personally prefer my villains to be done. I don't mind them being strictly evil, or for them to be relatable or empathetic, but I do like them playing an active role in the narrative and not just being on the sidelines watching on. It's one of the reasons I prefer, again, this is going to be for those people who have played Halo or are experienced in Halo's story. It's one of the reasons that I prefer Bungie's design when it comes to antagonists over 343 Industries, because they tend to prefer having the antagonist almost always off-screen and just in a room watching on and making plans, not really interacting with the main story or the characters in any direct way that's meaningful to me. When an antagonist has more direct action and is taking an active part in the story, that's when I tend to find them more compelling. It's one of the reasons why I like N so much, and why I don't really like Zed as a character. But again, Mobius was meant to be more of a concept, with Zed just representing the fact that he's at the head of it all. So you can make an argument here or there, but personally, I preferred the Mobius like N, like M, like D, like J, who were there in a story who felt like their own characters that were furthering the plot along. You could even have it be that the reason that he would take a more active stance this late into the game would be that through our actions in breaking the flame clocks and defeating various Mobius, he now believes that if he wants Ionios to survive, he has to step up out of the shadows and play an active role. I wouldn't have mind seeing something along the lines of integrating Sagiri's questline into the main story, with us having to find a way to free that final colony before infiltrating Origin. Like, really expand on them and make them a massive force to be reckoned with maybe legions of Pharaons at their beck and call. You could even flesh out the Senna characterization from that quest line and bring it into the main story, having it culminate with Senna finding her own place in the world and being able to instill that lesson into Colony Zero with accepting your own individuality or something. So you could even keep the story that was there in the Sagiri quest lines that were optional. You could keep faithful to that message and to that overall story, but just integrate it into the main story and expand on it. Then we transition to laying siege to Origin, with the colonies we have liberated aiding our efforts as we break into Origin with maybe Phaons at our side in one epic final battle, you know? Just something, you know? It doesn't have to be that, that's an example of something I would maybe have liked to have seen before the end of the game. Because leaving Agnes Castle felt to me like a halfway point, and it only really is if you set out to 100% the side stories or the side content and the hero quests before going into Origin, which I didn't like to do, I wanted to do in the postgame. And the pacing, which I love so much from chapters 1 to 5, felt relegated to the sidelines, as we had a few, albeit great, but still few, main story sections after Agnes Castle, and then an awkward fetch quest leading into the final dungeon. Just something fleshing it all out, personally would have made it resonate a little bit more for me. But you may disagree with me, and that's entirely cool. What I want you to do is leave a comment down below with your thoughts and your opinions, whether you liked or disliked that final chunk of Xenoblade 3 in terms of its pacing. Let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts and hear your opinions, and leave a like and subscribe if you liked the video and you want to see more content. I know I would appreciate it. Stay safe everybody, have a great day, hit the bell icon to be notified for when I upload in the future, go play some video games if you can, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye everybody.